Our speaker is Gábor Imre Kovács. He is an experienced computer science engineer with various interests in different engineering disciplines. He currently works as VP of Technology at Transcend and is an advocate of async communication. The title of the talk is Structures of Hope, When Grand Designs Meet Grim Realities. Please welcome on stage, with a huge round of applause, Gábor Imre Kovács.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me? That's good. Now let's see if the presenter works. It almost does. Thank you very much. So I'm Gábor Kovács. I work at Transcend. I'm a VP of Technology. I work in software engineering, software management in more than 10 years now. And this topic, when Grand Design Meets Green Realities, was the second title. So we actually had a vote at the company what to name this. And the original one that I proposed was civil engineering and urbanism in the 1950s in the USA, but that probably wouldn't attract that many people here. So this is going to be a little bit about urbanism, a little bit about management, architecture, and how we can apply it to our software companies. And since I expect that many of you are not urbanists, or at least not just interested in it, like I am, I will start with three different introduction topics for this. The first one is, what is public housing and how public housing is working, why it's an interesting thing. Public housing is not a new concept. The governments around the world started doing this centuries ago. And it means that some type of government helps the people who are basically low-income people to have some kind of housing opportunities. This is predominantly important in our current days, and it was coming mostly together in the 1900s, but it started much earlier than that. In the 1700s, there were already a couple of examples for this. For example, London was very, very lucky for the Great Fire of London because it actually made a whole new city for them. They could just demolish everything and rebuild the whole city for that. The other thing was Paris, who had multiple complete renovations, complete redesigns in the middle of the city. One during the revolution. Not so many people know that the catacombs of Paris is not filled with bones from like a war or the revolution or anything. It was actually cemeteries that were inside the city at the time. They had to remove those cemeteries completely for health and safety issues, but also for housing issues. So to build more spaces to work and house people within the city. And this is just coming together for the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution just kicked in and urbanization became a much bigger thing. So many people, and more people went to the cities as well. And by the end of the 19th century, every single European city had at least one major redesign. This is probably the best example for that. It's called the Example in Barcelona. And I would like to shout out to Gábor Varga, who created this presentation. And he's one of the best show and tell people in the world. And he actually found this original layout, what they planned. And this is how it looks like now. It's one of the most amazing screens there. So what they did in Barcelona, they tried to do in many other cities as well. But population growth, urbanization didn't stop in the 19th century. It actually grew much more in the 20th century. But we started to not just look into redesigning our cities, but redesigning suburbs and everything else. One of the key components and the key person to do this was Le Corbusier. And if you go from this meeting knowing only one new person, Le Corbusier is the one you should know about. He is the most influential architect for the 20th century, or possibly in the top 3 for every single list. He was a Swiss-French architect, and he designed multiple buildings, but it's not just his buildings, but his concepts and ideas that made him very, very popular. One of the most important we will talk about, one of the most important that we will basically just see around, if you just go around, is called La Vie Radieuse. This was actually a planned concept, but the main idea behind it was that instead of building small houses, let's build a big large towers, basically, living towers. It's like 40, 50-story buildings. But make it like everybody will have balcony, everybody will have windows, everybody will have access to fresh air, built with elevators, obviously. And between the houses, let's leave some space. He was not really a fan of Manhattan on those kind of architecture because it was too crowded for him, making it a little bit more livable, have some green in it, and also making small, low-size buildings for grocery stores, banks, post offices. If this sounds very, very interesting, this is basically the design between the panel houses that we see in Europe or Eastern Europe as well. Many other strategies were designed at time, but this one, this part of the Vie Radieuse was actually the most influential, and we can still see the effects of it. One more thing about this, he later designed the Athens Charter, which is a, I would say, multiple architects' idea how to build like planned cities, and they actually used a similar design to build like the complete Brazil new capital and multi other planned cities. As I mentioned, the Vie Radieuse project was an actual project. So it had concepts, but it was an actual project, and it actually never happened. He planned to build these in the middle of Paris. And you can see on this picture the Louvre and the Notre Dame too. And thankfully this never happened, because that would look very, very bad. But the whole idea behind all this is actually done. So this was the first introductory topic about public housing and Le Corbusier. The second will be about 3 examples of public housing. Because we obviously know the panel houses, we obviously know a lot of things, but let's see 3 unique examples. These were all built between the 50s and the 60s in the Western Europe, near Paris. And if you are not familiar with it, the panel house is mostly in Hungary, built in the 70s and 80s, so we were a little bit behind it. And one of the main reasons these buildings are not so popular right now is that 20-year gap. Because most of the public housing spaces are designs of their own time. If you need running water in the kitchen, you will get running water in the kitchen. But if you didn't need running water in the kitchen, it's going to be a completely new thing for the next design of houses. And current panel houses are almost exactly to the needs as to the people of the 21st century. So the first one is going to be at Noisy-le-Grand, which is a suburban area that was developed between the 50s and the 60s in Paris. It is halfway between the Disneyland and the center of Paris. And I actually visited both of these monuments that will be here. These are all public housing projects. The first one is called the Espace Abraxas. It is designed by Ricardo Bofill. And if you ever visit it, nowadays, don't really. It reeks of urine at the bottom level. It's very not a good place to be, but it looks awesome. And also, it is used as the setting for Hunger Games. So it's a little bit dystopian looking. Not really much, it's not full. As far as I know, the capacity is about 80 to 75%, so it's not completely full, and mostly low-income people. And a couple of years ago, they had actually an idea that maybe they will demolish it completely, because it just couldn't be profitable to make it up to the standards, but they allocated some resources and it will stay in the future too. So there's going to be a renovation. I think that decision happened like 2 years ago. A very, very similar building, or at least similar idea, similar brutalist Bauhaus building, with public housing also, publicly founded. What happened just a couple blocks away is called the Arène de Picasso. It was built almost 10 years later than the Espace Abraxas, but also it was renovated about 10 years earlier than the Espace Abraxas. It doesn't have that urine issue anymore, like the other one. It is actually a very, very open thing, but it was also not up to the standards of the living, and this is why there was a major renovation. The third one is going to be a little bit different, and also a different part of Paris. So this one is next to a major transportation hub. And one of the reasons Paris and many of these big cities can have a large agglomeration without much car issues is transportation hubs. And this one, La Sourderie, was planned to be at a transportation hub in the 60s. This was designed by the same architect as the first one, Ricardo Bofill, and it is planned on basically redesigning buildings based on French castles. So that was the plan behind it. He actually wanted to create a palace for the people. The behind part is called La Sourderie. And the major issue with this one today, and the reason it is not as popular, is because eventually the transportation hub that was planned for be very near this is almost 3 kilometers away, which is a lot in Paris. So that 3 kilometers is just, you can only take the buses, you cannot take the couple railways, and this is why they needed extra parking spaces, extra stuff around it. And it is still a very, very livable place, and from all of these, I would live in this myself, mostly, but it's just not in a very good place at the moment. So these were 3 examples. These were all built in the 50s, 60s, and you can look at even less stunning buildings like that in public housing, and you will see the same issues. They are not up to the standards, they need to be renovated, extended, something like that. This is the key takeaway from this lesson. And the third one is going to be at USA housing. We all know that there are major differences between Europe and US. There are very comic differences between Europe and US, obviously cars, guns, everything else. This one, I think, is probably the most important that nobody talks about. And this is actually relevant to everything else that we are talking, like cars. USA doesn't really believe in public housing. They still have public housing, they still have public housing projects, but in Hungary, currently, let's say there are 10 million people living in Hungary, 2 million of those are living in a place which was designed by a public housing project. So 20%. In the US, this number is exactly the same, 2 million. So 0.5% of their people. This was mostly done in the 20th century. There was no really public housing efforts before that, except for the slavery, but that was a very, very different topic. And what we needed to talk about in this is 2 important dates. So the US realized at some point that they will need to create some housing for the low-income people, because the private market will just not do. The private market will do 2 things. They will build very tall company buildings, like in Manhattan, because the companies are rich and they can afford a very tall building. And they will build family houses for people in the suburban area. That's the 2 things that the private market wants. And the private market basically, they would lobby against any kind of public housing that would be close to a suburban style housing project. So in 1937, right after basically during the big financial crisis, the Congress asked for architects. Basically, there were no urbanists at the time. The term wasn't invented, but architects and urbanists to design how to, basically policies, how to build some kind of chance to have a public housing in the US. And what they came up with was the exact opposite of Le Corbusier's plan. They wanted to build mixed zoning, basically like transportation hubs around the city in the suburban area, similar to what we've seen in Paris. Mixed zoning means it will have multiple like public housing also, but also offices, also stores, also banks and posts, basically in the same area. This thing called mixed zoning is very, very common in Europe. This is basically everywhere in Europe if you look around. Every intercity in Europe is the same way. But it's a very unique thing to Europe because US doesn't do that. And well, this plan, the 1937 plan, with all this, never came to fruition. They didn't do anything about it, and then the Second World War came, and the issue wasn't solved. So what they did is to act basically rashly. After the Second World War, they actually acted. This is called the Truman Housing Act. That they just decided on. And this was exactly the opposite of the 1937 idea what to do. It was make something very big, make something that will be very good for politically. That's what I wanted to say, sorry. So there were multiple other things in this. And the most important is to remove the slums from the inner cities, basically places where mostly the predominantly African Americans lived, demolish those complete places, not build in the suburbs, but demolish those and build public housing buildings, high-rising public buildings instead of them in the middle of the city. This was positive for the security, this was positive for the white waters. This was positive for actually the private housing too, because this was very high-rise buildings. They would never build those for public housing purposes, and this was also very positive for politicians because they could just show them off. This thing, the Truman Housing Act, and the thing they called it the urban renewal, was actually a big success. So they also consider it, and some of those buildings are still standing. This is the two bridges in Manhattan. This is one of the excuse me. This was one of the most famous housing projects at the time. It is still standing, it is still very okay, and it exactly looks like the Le Corbusier buildings I showed you before. But there are many others which were just demolished or repurposed in the last couple of years and decades. And this is where we can start our main topic today, the Pruitt-Igoe project. This is probably the most famous public housing project in the world, and not many people know about it, sadly. The Pruitt-Igoe project happened started in 1950, so right after the Truman Housing Act, and it was named after Pruitt, an African-American fighter pilot, and Igoe, a white Caucasian congressman from Missouri. And the main difference between them, and the main reason it was called Pruitt-Igoe, because it was originally planned as a segregated housing. So one for the African-American people and one part for the Caucasian people. And this was actually stopped in the middle of it. So the building started in 1952 and it was finished in 1954 and 55. And in 54 the segregation was stopped in the US by a law. Obviously this will never stop in psychology, but technically it stopped, so they couldn't do it anymore. This is how it became one major complex. What they wanted to do is exactly the same as what I mentioned before. They wanted to remove a slum area called DeSoto Car. They had 1 square kilometer of space, and they wanted to build housing, high-rise housing, with things that they never had before, or at least not many people had before. For example, every single apartment would have toilets, which was a good thing there. Every single apartment would have central heating. Every single apartment would have running water in the bathroom and in the kitchen too, and they would have a bunch of other things that not every people had before then, especially not low-income people. Now it seems very, very silly that I'm saying this, but this was actually true at the time. And this is why, when it was built, all the 33 buildings, there were 33 buildings, all of them 11 stories high, and in the 1 square kilometer, it was almost fully occupied, so 95%, which is very good for a public housing project at the time. 95% of it was basically about 9,500 people who were living in there. It was designed about 10,000 people at the time. What they said about it, the occupants here, is that it was more than 98% said that it is predominantly better than any housing they had before. The only thing that we have to talk about before we go to the next chapter is, obviously because of the segregation law changed and everything else, there was an event called the White Flight, which happened almost in every single city, every single public housing project around the same time, which is for the same reason that segregation was just as a law enforced. It means that because it was not a segregated part anymore, the white people who could afford it just went to basically having new suburban places instead of going into this low-income housing. They had better chances to get bank loan, they had better chances to go there, so they went there. So the Pruitt-Igoe complex at the end became a predominantly African-American community. And community they was. What's very, very important is the whole design of these buildings by the architect was to build a community for them. And we will talk about it a little bit later, but they actually started to act like a community. The original plans included playgrounds between the buildings, which never came to fruition, but they forced the government to do that. So they, as a community, stand together, and basically they made this place a very, very livable thing in 1956. One thing that I didn't talk about before, and this was a big innovation for this, they wanted it to be a big innovation for this project, is called the skip-stop elevators. I'm not sure if you ever seen this. There are still buildings with skip-stop elevators, but just for a different purpose. It means that the elevator is skipping a couple of stories. And the main plan behind this one exactly in Pruitt-Igoe, was that these were 11-story buildings. There will be an elevator stop at 1, 4, 7, and 9. Sorry, 10. 1, 4, 7, and 10. And this meant that if you wanted to go to like the 11th or the 9th floor, you will have to go to the 10th floor and you have to use the stairs. The main plan behind this was community. Those floors, the 1, 4, 7, and 10, were anchor floors. They had laundry rooms, they had garbage chutes, they had like community places. Basically, maybe a little bit too much of community places as well, and not too many apartments. And they were basically like forcing the people to meet each other, to be a community together. This was a partially architecture choice, and this was one of the things that currently we consider as a bad choice. Psychologists later said that this is not how you build a building. This was a good experiment, but this is not how you build a building. You don't need that many community spaces. So what was the reality after that? In 55, the last buildings were finished, and from 55, it seemed everything is okay. One thing that seemed a little bit off for the tenants too is how they actually paid for this. So in Hungary and in many of the Eastern communities where we built public housing, it was mostly for buying them for the people. In the US, it was mostly for renting. And how they did it is that they created a company by the government that had no additional funding, and they had to basically use a low rent to fund everything that they had. And that low rent was not enough. This is, I think, pretty easy to see. From those 10,000 people, and it's basically a community of 10,000 people, there will be one broken window in a community room. And if there's a broken window in a community room and nobody can fix it in 2 days because the whole service is underfunded, there will be another broken window. Because broken windows are like rabbits. If you have let some loose, there will be much more. And by 1958, so only in 3 years, the vandalism took over, mostly the community spaces, mostly the higher elevation stories, but even that the company actually established a security force at the time to fight this. The occupancy from 95% went down to 75% in just 3 years, with a 20% turnaround. So basically people just try to leave and try to stay there. And with vandalism comes the newer and newer and newer issues. This video, I will start it right now, is from the 1982 Koyani Squadzi. It's an experimental documentary, and it's a 2-minute video about Pruitt-Igoe. This is the same building we've seen. It's about 10 years where we are, so it's in the 1970s, and this is how it ended. Around that time, around 1960, where I was, the architect of this building visited it and said, I never thought people were that destructive. In the 60s, in the early 60s, it went down to 50% occupancy. And in 1967, there was no more funding for the security to take place. And in 1969, after the company tried to raise the rent to somehow mitigate the situation, there was a rent strike. So basically, the people stopped paying rent for 9 months, which just bankrupted the whole company and the whole housing complex. So in 1970, this was very, very good for one group of people, which is called psychologists. There were tons of psychologists flooding the building and basically just surveying the people, why the hell you are living here? And at that time, at 1970, just a couple years before these videos were taken, 78% of the occupants said that they were satisfied with the building itself, with the conditions that they are living in. And 80% said it's little better or much better than anything they ever lived in before. This is how the housing situation was at the time. In 1970, only 10 of those 33 buildings were occupied, and in 1971, a couple of them were already demolished, and they tried to mitigate it. They tried to like change it, demolish just a couple of stories to make it lower, but nothing worked. And by 1976, all of the buildings were demolished. So they were started building it in 1952 and demolished the last one in 1976. They lived less than 25 years. The whole place, which is in the middle of St. Louis, was empty for almost 50 years. They had no idea what to do with it because this was a big scar in the whole government. Basically, in the U.S. side, this is used still as an example of how not to build a housing project. But right now, 2 years ago, they actually added the two demolitions at the end. They actually added a new campus there, so it's currently for the St. Louis University. And in a couple of years, hopefully, there will be no other remaining parts of Pruitt-Igoe. So what we will need to learn about this? The first question is obviously what everybody is saying after every kind of failure, every bug. Who fucked up? Who made a mistake? And obviously it's easy to point out the architect. It was Minoru Yamasaki, and who designed this building. He was only 40 at the time. This was his first major project. And he planned this in the Le Corbusier-based design. You can actually see everything from the Le Corbusier part here. But he didn't want it to. He actually wanted to more follow the 1937 plans. He actually understood why it was better, but he was forced to do it because that was what's politically there. He after became a well-accomplished architect. He built the Rainier Tower and the IBM building in Seattle. He designed those. He designed the Century Plaza Towers in Los Angeles. He designed the Torre Picasso in Madrid. And most famously, he designed the World Trade Center. So the same person who designed the Pruitt-Igoe designed the World Trade Center. He didn't see the fall of this building, sadly. He passed away in 1986, much before that. So what's the conclusion? My conclusion. When I first heard this story 20 years ago, I said, well, that's good. Even if you make a huge mistake, you can still design the World Trade Center. You can still be a big architect. That's good. And nowadays, I don't think so. Nowadays, I very much think that this story is not about Minoru Yamasaki. It could be any other architect. It could be any other thing. The main, because there's always going to be a rent issue. There's always going to be something in your way. But what I started to investigate during this presentation is that I think the major reason why these buildings don't make it to, I would say, adulthood, like the French buildings too, they need complete renovations, is that they are designs for their time. They are lean designs. Maybe a little bit over architecture sometimes, but lean designs for their times. They are not planned to be a very, very long-standing thing. And I actually stumbled around the recent statistics just a couple of weeks ago when I was preparing for this, that in the US, since 2010, I don't know what was the end of it, but since 2010, it is 15 times more likely that they will demolish a building that was built after 1950 than before 1950. And that's a very good question. Why do we demolish the new buildings? Why don't we demolish the old ones? I don't have a European standard, but I actually see the same thing. The old buildings are there. And I have one, maybe stupid, and it's going to be a very, very anecdotal evidence, but I would like you give it as a brain of thought, basically a little crumble, is that build architecture, build buildings with wide walls. Because if you build a house that will not have running water in the kitchen because that's not up to the standards, and you build it with narrow walls, similar to Bauhaus style, because that's all you need, you will not have enough space to add another pipe when that's going to be needed. The only reason why we still have the panel houses in Hungary and not demolish them is that the only thing that is like generally accepted and invented since they were built is the climatization. And this is why if you look at any of those buildings, you will see it's basically a big leg of fans nowadays because the climatization had to be added. But if it's anything more than that, that wouldn't be needed, a complete redesign of the building, they will not be able to do it. Actually, Hungary is very lucky that they started the public housing much later than the other parts of the world. So this is my general takeaway. Build buildings, build architecture with wider walls. Even if they say it's anti-pattern, even if they will say that this is maybe not the best way to do it, maybe this is not for the current, I don't know, Python 5.6 and React 14.0, basically design something from the major blocks that you have available, because if you're doing that, it will stand much longer. And 50 years in the architecture, 50, 70 years for most of them, is less than a year in the IT world. We all know that. So whenever you're thinking about architecture, think about Pro-Igo and think about why not do it just for that one project, just for that idea. Thank you very much. I should have cued you.
No, that's okay. I just got wire issues. It got stuck in the chair. Question time. Please use the QR code and ask your questions. Until they get in, awesome slides.
Thank you very much.
Your slides were
for Gábor
so
Varga,
great.
so he's the best
Who did the slides? Hands up.
Yes.
Congratulations, amazing slides. Very well done. Okay. As it is usually, sometimes you gotta wait a little and then all the questions come in. Actually, as I was listening to your presentation, I thought I would want to go and see it, how it looks now, but then it turns out it already got...
You can go there in GeoGuessr, it's still an empty space. So if you go there in Google Maps, you can actually see the completely emptiness in the middle of St. Louis.
Okay, very exciting.
It's just
I'll check it out.
It's just like a couple of grass and a couple of trees.
Okay, I'll check it out. And we have our first question. We can imagine wide walls as a fail-safe.
Yes.
Can you give us a simple example in IT architecture?
I would give you a general example. I'm not sure who asked the question. So for me, this means that you can, if you are building only for a fail-safe solution and not for the whole design, that's always going to be an overhead. So if you're building your whole designs except for that now predominant, now very important, best architecture way and using more simple building blocks, basically the wider walls, I think is going to be better. So like one of the examples, in .NET, there were a couple of new additions in the recent one that came out in November. There are new ones in the .NET community that's coming out every single year, and half of them will never make it to 2 years, and 80% of them will never make it to 5 years. And if you're starting to build based on one of those platforms, it will just simply not work in the long term. So just because it's a good thing, build on the good old walls. That was my idea there.
Okay, we got a second one. How do you strike the balance between over-engineering and designing for the future?
That is a very good question, and I think it's a very case-by-case situation. I think one thing that we tend to forget as developers and software engineers is that extensibility is not really extensibility. So many of the cases when we are thinking about extensibility, we are thinking of a CRUD project, we are exactly thinking of the panel houses. It's a very simple architecture that we can just copy-paste and we can just go away with it. But we don't know how the product will evolve. We don't know how the product will want to be extensible. And sometimes when you will need to touch that extensibility layer, which is probably the most complex layer because you wanted it to be easy, is going to be the biggest issue. So one thing is not over-engineer any part of it. Make it a very simple one. And what I always said is that I like to design my softwares that if I have a junior there, I can show you, if you do exactly like this in this part, it will be fine. There will be no code review issues, there will be nothing else. You do exactly like this. So make it like a junior can read it. Because if you add anything else to it, it's going to be for seniors. At some point, you will hate yourself. You will face the similar, every single electrical engineer that you always invite asks, who the fuck made that mess? It was you last time. So this is exactly what you will see as an architect. So I think this is my grain of salt here. So design it so a junior can understand it.
Okay, new one came in the meantime. What do you consider as good old wall technologies?
Well, this is, I think, there are hundreds of examples between the stack of what you're working with. So if you're asking five years younger than me, I would never say go with a NoSQL database. But nowadays, I think I always go with a NoSQL database. So this evolves. But we are in the IT world, and everything comes in, like I said, with the .NET 1. Something that came out in the last half a year is usually, yeah, we can be the early adopters. We can be the early adopters for pet projects or something like that. But if you're just starting to build up something that's going to take, you want it to live for at least 5 years, then don't use some kind of very, very new thing just because you want to try it out, just because it seems very, very OP at the moment, just because an online programmer influencer influenced you, because that's kind of a thing right now.
Okay. Public housing is a hard sell.
Yeah.
I see similarities with software where focus is on money-bringing features, not quality of life. Is there a solution?
Well, quality of life for the software is usually a money-making feature. So if it's quality of life for the developers, well, this is why the software managers are. I actually received the same exact question just a couple hours ago at the stand. Is that how do you manage that as a software manager? And well, this is a fight that we have to take. This is basically our job as software managers, is to somehow balance between what is necessary for the company to work and what is necessary for the software development to basically make it to standard and make it to there. So this is the whole job. It's very, very hard to explain it. But what my my general takeaway is obviously there are these very, very easy wins that if you're fixing something, then look around it and try to make it a little bit better, try to make it do that. But those are usually not really going to work out in the long term. You need to have kind of a say in that. In our company at Transcend, what we are doing is, even when we have these kind of issues, we are trying to basically have kind of balance and a compromise, and thinking, okay, this one we will have to go forward, but this one we will basically have to just slow down and make it a better architecture. But like I said, this is the whole job, so it's very, very hard to just summarize it in a question.
Next question is from Lucas. Could you please give an example of what kind of choice you would reject in a code review?
Well, there are actually, I think, 2 different ways in that. I would not really go with a very over-engineered solution, and I would not go with a very, very under-engineered solution as well. So I would say, you know, fake strings in something, that's obviously not a good thing. And there are these very, very common things that I would not accept. But, you know, the base architecture will never be done by a junior developer, but the base architecture has to be done by somebody who can speak to a junior developer, and the junior developer can understand it. That's the point. So very rookie mistakes I would not see in them. In the over-engineered way, I actually have many examples from my recent past for these, and I'm actually a very democratic person, so I'm always like, okay, if everybody likes it, then let's go with it. But there are this joke around the community that .NET developers are building interfaces everywhere, and I recently saw in the code, not at our company, something that was built on an interface that was built on an interface that was built on an interface that was just a simple CRUD application, and I had no idea why the heck they did it, and well, that would not be something that I would just allow in my code if I would do it. I actually listed it as a major issue, that it is just simply not. They build it for extensibility, but this is why they don't understand extensibility very well, because you can't really extend that. It's just basically another, I don't know, 200 lines of code, and another, I don't know, 200 lines of code that you will need to copy paste when you want to do one other thing. It doesn't help you with anything.
All right. Last chance for a question. Nobody's touching their phone, so probably this was the last question. Okay, thank you very much. A huge round of applause for our presenter.